I'm Dave Feldman. I'm a professor in urban planning and public policy and political science. And I also direct a university-wide center called Water UCI that does research, education, and public outreach on water issues. We bring decision makers and non-governmental organizations and even people from around the world in to talk about water issues to the UCI community and beyond. So there are two really major issues facing Southern California right now. One is the future resilience of water supply, especially for cities. The periodic droughts that we have in Southern California are likely to get worse in the future due to climate change, climate variability. So it's very important for cities to be able to identify novel and alternative sources of water supply. The recycling of wastewater, more aggressive conservation efforts, the harvesting of rainwater, and desalination where it might have an appropriate application in the region. Some of these issues are true throughout the country and throughout the state of California, but especially Southern California, where we have special vulnerabilities because so much of our water supply is imported. Although we do have a groundwater basin here in Orange County, which also is an asset because it can be recharged through wastewater and through stormwater on the surface. The second big issue, and it's an issue that's definitely increasing in importance nationwide, but has a special resonance here in Southern California, is water quality. In particular, what chemists call emerging contaminants. These are pollutants that basically have their origins in a number of consumer products and practices. Pharmaceutical products, cosmetics, personal care products, even in some cases the clothing we wear. And these emerging contaminants enter the water supply in very minute quantities, but they accumulate in the human body and in other organisms. And we know that they pose some risks to public health. We're not always certain what those risks are or in what threshold amounts, but they're a challenge for water agencies that increasingly are under pressures from regulators and, of course, from the public to make sure that our potable water supplies are as safe and secure as possible. One of the greatest sources of runoff pollution in the United States, and especially here in Southern California, is impervious surfaces. Surfaces in which water cannot percolate down into the ground and recharge groundwater basins, and in turn carries a variety of pollutants from our yards and our parking lots and our roofs of buildings, and just carries them right to the ocean. Actually, these impervious surfaces include, to a very high degree in Southern California, transportation arteries, roadways, sidewalks, and those sorts of things. And it also matters in terms of things like the possibility of flooding. And while it doesn't rain all that often in Southern California, when it does, these impervious surfaces from transportation in particular can worsen flooding by making the flows of water more rapid and of greater volume. So right here in Irvine, under our feet, ranging from roughly 200 to maybe 1,000 meters, is a large groundwater basin. And that groundwater basin is a major source of public water supply for those of us living, particularly in South Orange County. That groundwater basin provides water supply for about 2 million people. Where does that water come from? Well, it basically has three sources. One is just the natural rainfall and snowmelt that comes down through the Santa Ana River Channel and other streams, eventually percolates into the soil and reaches this groundwater basin. However, as we withdraw water from that basin, there are pressures from the ocean to push into that groundwater basin, which brings me to the second source of supply and a great asset. Since the 1990s, Orange County has led the nation, quite literally, in using recycled effluent, effectively wastewater that's treated to a high degree of purity and is pumped back into this groundwater basin where it resides for quite some period of time. and then becomes a source not only of replenishment for the groundwater basin, but it keeps the Pacific Ocean from intruding into that basin, and it's the source of the water that we drink and shower and bathe with virtually every day here in South Orange County. A third source of supply are imports of water. And by imports, I mean water that is quite literally piped here, largely from the Colorado River and some from the Bay Delta in Northern California. And through a vast system of aqueducts and distribution and treatment systems, it finds its way into local water agencies. Various local water agencies, and Irvine Ranch Water District is very much ahead of the curve, has a separate recycling facility called the Michelson plant over near the marsh, which takes runoff primarily that goes into San Diego Creek that runs off from various commercial and residential properties in the region and basically recycles that water in order to provide a sufficient level of treatment, not to drink, but to use on landscaping. And if you drive around Irvine, you'll see many signs that say recycled water in use. This way, local agencies like Irvine Ranch can treat water to a quality that's suitable for landscaping, but they don't have to spend the money to treat it to drinking water quality. And the public gets the benefit of different grades of water for different uses, different applications. When we think about water, particularly when we get up in the morning, we think of hot and cold taps on our sinks and in our showers and so forth. But policymakers, particularly in California and in Southern California especially, think of water more broadly. For example, water is very cheap for us. We don't pay a lot of money to have water delivered to our homes and businesses. But policymakers know that water really isn't cheap. And in fact, when we pay our water bill at the end of each month, we're not actually buying water. We're paying for water services. Somebody has to acquire that water, has to divert it great distances to bring it into our homes, and then after it leaves our homes, they have to treat that water before it's released into rivers and streams or used to recharge our groundwater basins. All of the things I just mentioned are really huge policy issues. In what way? Well, let me give you three ways. For one thing, it means that people in decision making have to be forward thinking. They have to understand where they're going to get water in the future because our population is growing, our water demands are growing, and as I mentioned before, water isn't really cheap. It costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of work to acquire it and to treat it and to distribute it into our homes. A second way this is a big policy issue is that water decision makers have to invest vast sums of money and expertise into maintaining this vast system of water supply. And that means they have to be technologically on top of every possible challenge that we might encounter, even challenges that we might not see, like the contaminants of concern that I mentioned before, or making sure that we can treat our wastewater not as a waste, but as a resource, a renewable resource, which means sustainability. So that's a second way that decision makers really think about policy in this regard. And a third broad area where policy enters the picture, and I say this as somebody that's a political scientist who studies water, the acquiring of water, the claim of rights to water, the need to treat water, the need to clean water, all of these things create social conflicts. And those social conflicts have to be resolved by decision makers. The kinds of equipments and technologies that are necessary for detecting contaminants, monitoring those contaminants, and removing and treating those contaminants is becoming increasingly technologically sophisticated. Many of our monitoring systems use various remote sensing technologies. They're highly automated in many cases. They're definitely computerized, and water agencies are increasingly dependent on collecting large amounts of data and then somehow collating and collecting and analyzing that data so that they know everything there is to know about the quality of water and the available supply of water, right down to the flow of every single drop entering and leaving your house at this very moment. These are things that are increasingly important. The most sophisticated equipment in the world is worthless if you don't have qualified people who know how to build it, maintain it, operate it, read it, and sense when something isn't going right. And we have found repeatedly in the United States and in other places around the world that the human factor, the ability to process this information and then make sound decisions, is extremely important. Don't take my word for it. Ask the residents of Flint, Michigan, who recently found that out just a few years ago. The assumption was that drinking water treatment systems pretty much take care of themselves and you don't really have to worry about the human element. Well, you do.